autorytarnych reżimów, poczynając od gospodarczego i technologicznego wsparcia do tirańskich, śmiercionośnych dronów, od bezpośredniego udziału wojsk Korei Północnej, od wsparcia reżimu białoruskiego Łukaszenki, aż po niedostateczne zauważone w Europie wsparcie komunistycznej Kuby. Nasi ukraińscy partnerzy, a także przyjaciele z opozycji demokratycznej kubańskiej alarmują, że w tej chwili w wojnie na Ukrainie, w agresywnej rosyjskiej wojnie, bierze udział kilka tysiące najemników kubańskich. W takim kraju jak Kuba, gdzie panuje dyktatura kraju, odbywał się bez aprobaty, bez akceptacji reżimu komunistycznego. To jest rzecz zupełnie oczywista. Na pewno nie dziwi w tej sytuacji fakt, że Kuba znajduje się dalej na liście państw wspierających terroryzm, na którą wpisała to państwo Stany Zjednoczone. Nie może nas zaskoczyć fakt, że Kubańczycy stanowili, jak pokazują wydarzenia ostatnich dni, osobistą ochronę dla dyktatora Wenezueli Maduro. Reżim agresywny, komunistyczny reżim prowadzi swoje działania na świecie. I to musi być dostrzeżone. Naszym celem jest oczywiście akcja informacyjna, żeby jak najszerzej obywatelom Europy przybliżyć te sprawy, ale tak naprawdę chcemy i domagamy się zmiany polityki Unii Europejskiej wobec reżimu komunistycznego na Kubie. Szanowni Państwo, od 10 lat realizowana jest umowa o współpracy i dialogu między Unią Europejską a Kubą. W wyniku tej współpracy reżim komunistyczny zobowiązał się, że będą na Kubie przestrzegane prawa człowieka, a w zamian Unia będzie przekazywała konkretne środki finansowe na rozwój Kuby. Co roku miliony euro ze środków europejskich trafiają na Kubę. Mamy pełną jasność sytuacji, że prawa człowieka na Kubie deptane są każdego dnia, że więzienia kubańskie zapełnione są więźniami politycznymi. Jak można kontynuować tę umowę? Naszym celem jest zmiana tej naiwnej, ale tak naprawdę niezwykle szkodliwej polityki Unii Europejskiej wobec agresywnego, komunistycznego, autorytarnego reżimu. To jest nasz cel. Mówimy to jasno i będziemy podejmowali działania, żeby zmienić umowy o współpracy i dialogu między Unią Europejską a Kubą musi być natychmiast zamrożona. Nie ma najmniejszego politycznego, a i tym bardziej moralnego uzasadnienia, żeby wspierać ten reżim. Nie możemy być zakładnikami jakichś ideologicznych założeń niektórych grupowań tu w parlamencie, którzy bronią tej umowy. My musimy mówić jasno. Są łamane prawa człowieka, są więźniowie polityczni na Kubie. Kuba bierze udział w różnego typu agresywnych działaniach, tak jak na Ukrainie, tak jak mieliśmy to w Wenezueli, przykłady ostatnio zaangażowania służb kubańskich w ochronę reżimu, w ochronę dyktatora. Tego dłużej tolerować nie możemy. Czas z tym skończyć, czas natychmiast zawiesić umowę o współpracy między Unią Europejską a Kubą. Żaden euro ze środków europejskich nie może trafić w ręce reżimu komunistycznego. To wszystko, co mam do powiedzenia. Bardzo proszę, ale witam.
Dziękuję, Mario. Thank you, everybody. I will use the chance to speak in Italian. My mother tongue, so I will ask you to keep your earphones or take them. Grazie al collega Kaminsky e al collega Mlarczyk per aver voluto promuovere questo momento di approfondimento. È un piacere per me darvi il benvenuto anche a nome del Policy Group, del gruppo ICA dedicato all'America Latina, che abbiamo voluto ricostituire pochi mesi fa, proprio per dedicarci in maniera più attenta e più specifica a tutte le problematiche concernenti la necessità di recuperare presto la libertà in tutti i paesi dell'America Latina che sono fortemente in sofferenza. Cogliamo ovviamente con favore i segnali che arrivano, sia quelli che sono nati dalle urne, pensiamo al caso del Cile o della Bolivia recentemente, sia quelli che abbiamo visto negli ultimi giorni, sperando che sia l'alba di una nuova fase che possa aprire anche per i fratelli venezuelani una stagione di democrazia e di libertà. E in questo modo naturalmente questa è anche l'occasione per ribadire un sostegno che dal primo giorno, da quel terribile 24 febbraio del 2022, il nostro gruppo non ha mai fatto mancare agli amici ucraini, essendo in questa Camera forse il gruppo che con più forza e più coerenza ha sempre sostenuto la causa dell'Ucraina. Ed è molto importante in questo momento di confronto di oggi, perché quando parliamo della presenza di cittadini mercenari cubani che combattono a fianco dell'esercito russo in Ucraina, noi non dobbiamo considerare questo fenomeno come qualcosa di nuovo, come qualcosa di isolato o di anomalo, perché questo caso ucraino non nasce dal nulla, non nasce nel vuoto. Per Cuba, diciamo, questo rappresenta l'ultimo anello di una lunga catena di interventi esterni che Cuba porta avanti da molto tempo, da decenni, oggi ovviamente adattato a tempi che cambiano, contesti che cambiano. C'è una differenza fondamentale rispetto ad altre situazioni in cui Cuba aveva mandato le proprie truppe regolari. Queste ovviamente non sono truppe regolari, parliamo di mercenari, di persone reclutate su base individuale, ovviamente sulla base di promesse economiche e con, diciamo, contratti opachi, per non dire di peggio. La cornice ideologica dell'internazionalismo non regge più. Quello che però resta è un bacino di manodopera che viene utilizzato per sostenere questo sforzo bellico che, diciamo, che altri non vogliono pagare dal punto di vista politico. E abbiamo visto, parlando del Venezuela, Mario prima lo accennavi, quanto questo sia stato importante nella traiettoria che ha coinvolto il Venezuela. In Venezuela abbiamo visto che Cuba non si è limitata a inviare medici o insegnanti, ma ha fornito apparati di sicurezza, intelligence, ha fornito sistemi di controllo, contribuendo a tenere diciamo, vivo il regime di Maduro nei momenti anche di maggiore instabilità interna. In cambio di questo, il Venezuela di Maduro ha garantito a Cuba forniture energetiche essenziali, permettendo al regime di poter sopravvivere a una crisi economica che purtroppo sta strangolando il popolo cubano da molto tempo. Quindi è un intervento, quello cubano, che oggi è sempre più funzionale, pragmatico e sempre meno ideologico, anche se Cuba rappresenta in qualche modo nell'emisfero occidentale la testa del serpente, un po' lo stesso ruolo che nell'emisfero orientale svolge l'Iran per altri versi, e le due cose sono ovviamente non a caso collegate e fanno parte dello stesso network. Questo non riguarda soltanto l'ambito militare. Negli ultimi anni il regime cubano ha fatto un uso sistematico e strumentale anche di altre figure professionali anche in Occidente. Pensiamo a quello che è stato fatto dopo il Covid, quando migliaia di medici e infermieri cubani sono stati inviati come agenti del regime, di fatto, come strumenti di soft power in Occidente, in Europa, purtroppo anche nella mia Italia, a prestare servizio in sostituzione di personale locale che non era disponibile per mancanza di manodopera. Quindi uno strumento di penetrazione politica per dare un volto positivo al regime e avere allo stesso modo degli agenti che controllano anche la dissidenza nei paesi occidentali. E qui chiudo riprendendo le parole del collega Kaminsky. Noi da sempre ci battiamo in quest'Aula per richiedere la sospensione del pilastro politico dell'accordo di cooperazione con Cuba. Riteniamo che a fronte di questa concessione che l'Europa ha fatto nei confronti del regime cubano non ci siano stati assolutamente dei passi avanti, e anzi questa concessione sia stata utilizzata dal regime per normalizzare i rapporti e fare in modo di ripulirsi in qualche modo la coscienza e la faccia verso la comunità internazionale, quindi è tempo di intensificare la pressione diplomatica, porre fine a quello che oggi è un feticcio, diciamo, qualcosa che non esiste. Non esiste dialogo politico con chi reprime i propri cittadini, con chi li lascia nella miseria, nella povertà, con chi li perseguita anche fuori dai confini di Cuba in tutto il mondo. Questo è quello che ci troviamo ad affrontare. Di fronte a questo l'Unione Europea deve cambiare atteggiamento e sospendere immediatamente il pilastro politico dell'accordo di cooperazione. Ringrazio ancora Marius e Arcadius per l'organizzazione, saluto tutti gli amici cubani e ucraini presenti in questa sala e collegati da remoto. Grazie.
Thank you very much. I'm the first speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues and guests, Cuba might seem like a backwater, impoverished communist hellhole. It's definitely that. Its intelligence and security apparatus is, however, quite impressive. As we have recently witnessed, 32 of Maduro's security personnel killed by Delta Force were Cuba. Elite officers from Havana's Revolutionary Armed Forces and Ministry of the Interior, who formed the core of the Venezuelan dictator's personal protection detail. This incident just day ago strictly illustrates the reach of greatness of Cuba's security machine even far beyond its shores. Today we gather for this public hearing on Cuban mercenaries in the Russian aggression against Ukraine to confront on equally alarming reality. When George Bush referred to the axis of evil in the early 2000s, his remark was mostly rhetorical. In today's world, the axis of evil is, however, real, and Cuba plays a significant role as its junior member, what is exemplified by Cuban mercenaries present on the Ukrainian front lines. Reliable intelligence from Ukrainian authorities, corroborated by U.S. assessment and independent reports, indicates that thousands of Cuban nationals, estimated range from several thousand up to as many as 20,000, have been recruited and deployed to fight alongside Russian forces in the brutal invasion of Ukraine. Many were lured with false promises of construction jobs or high-paying contracts, only to find themselves thrust into the mid-grinder of Putin's war. Others appear to have gone with the full complicity or even active facilitation of the Cuban regime. This is no isolated phenomenon. Cuba has a long history of exporting fighters and security expertise to probe us allied dictatorship from Africa in the Cold War era to Venezuela today. Now in 2025 and 2026, the Cuban state is enabling one of the largest contingents of foreign fighters, bolstering Russia's legal aggression, second only to North Korea in scale. These mercenaries are not volunteers in a noble cause. They cannot further in an imperial war that has claimed tens of thousands of lives, displaced millions, and threatens the very foundations of European security. We in the European Parliament cannot turn a blind eye. Russia's invasion is not just an attack on Ukraine. It is an assault on the rules-based international order that protects us all. By providing manpower to sustain this aggression, the Cuban regime becomes a direct enabler of war crimes, civilian suffering, and the erosion of sovereignty on our continent. This hearing is a vital step towards greater transparency and accountability. We will hear from experts, Ukrainian representatives, Cuban democratic voices, and others who have documented this pipeline of fighters. Their testimonies demand our attention and our action. We will also be joined by US representatives. The European Union must respond decisively, strengthen sanctions on this facilitating this recruitment, support efforts to identify and repatriate or prosecute involved parties, and stand firmly with Ukraine until victory. We must also amplify the voices of Cuba's own people who deserve freedom from a regime that exports repression while its citizens face poverty and coercion. Let this hearing mark the beginning of the remote resolve. The axis of evil is active. We must be bold. So, thank you for being. And now we start our conference. So, dear colleagues, we have 10 interventions ahead of us. Therefore, I will be brief and will give the floor to Oksana Yakun, Deputy Head of the Mission of Ukraine to the European Union, to hear directly from the Ukrainian officials how important the issue addressed by our conference is for our Ukrainian partners. Madam Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Honorable members of the Parliament, dear guests, good afternoon to everyone. First of all, before start, I would like to thank PCR Group for your continued support for Ukraine since the very first days of invasion, and also for your efforts in keeping support for Ukraine very high on the agenda of this House. So thank you for this. The topic of today's discussion highlights the far-reaching and destructive consequences of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Since 2022, we have witnessed how authoritarian regimes Belarus, Iran, and North Korea provided critical support to Russia in its unlawful war. At the same time, to sustain its war, its aggression, the Russian Federation has been actively recruiting foreign citizens in the ranks of its invasion army. The geography is very wide, from Central Asian countries to South Africa and Cuba in Latin America. And the scale of involvement of foreign fighters by Russia is shocking. And there is increasing evidence that in many cases, foreign citizens are recruited through deception. They are enticed by false promises of well-paid jobs, education, or legal status, only to be coerced to sign military contracts and sent to the front line to fight against Ukraine. The case of Cuba is particularly disturbing, because for many decades, Ukrainian and Cuban people have been connected by genuine human bonds. As a country who knows what communist reign means, we sympathize with the Cuban people's aspiration to live in dignity and in prosperity. Russia is cynically exploiting the desperate desire of Cubans to escape the island in search of a better life. While Cuban authorities officially deny the involvement of their citizens in Russia's war against Ukraine, facts on the ground suggest otherwise. Cuban citizens were captured on multiple occasions by Ukrainian defense forces on the front line, fighting alongside Russian troops. The latest case took place just 10 days ago on the 3rd of January in Bryansk, which is one of the hottest spots on the front line right now. According to available information, thousands of Cuban citizens have signed contracts joining the ranks of soldiers directly engaged in combat operations in Ukrainian soil. This massive recruitment is not a matter of isolated Cuban individuals acting on their own. It is a systematic practice involving illicit networks that operate openly with tacit condemnation of the authorities in Havana. The unwillingness of Cuban government to stop massive deployment of its nationals in the Russian war against Ukraine constitutes complicity in aggression. We remember how in 2024, the Cuban leader wished Putin success in his military campaign against Ukraine. At the same time, we haven't heard from the Cuban government any concerns about the fate of Cubans who were deceived or voluntarily recruited into the ranks of the Russian army and lost their lives also in Ukraine. The cost of inaction in the face of aggression is high. Continued recruitment of foreigners to fight against Ukraine allows Russia to minimize losses among its own population and sustain its war effort. Turning a blind eye to such actions gives Putin regime a lifeline and prolongs the war. It is crucial that the government which supports the aggression feels the pressure of the international community. And of course, the aggressor itself should feel the maximum pressure to end the war. So far, we have seen that despite intense diplomatic efforts led by the US and the active engagement of Europe, Russia still shows no interest in peace. The last massive Russian airstrikes against Ukrainian cities have left many people across all the country without heating, electricity, and water in very harsh winter conditions. Russia is deliberately exploiting extremely cold weather to launch hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles every day. This is Russia's idea of peace, killing civilians, terrorizing with missiles and cold in order to break Ukrainian resistance. These attempts will fail. Russia is acting as if it is winning. But the truth is that Putin's so-called special military operation, which was supposed to last for 3 days, already lasts longer than the Soviet Union fought in World War II. We will continue to coordinate closely with the US and European allies to restore a just and lasting peace based on the international law and the UN Charter. And effective security guarantees for Ukraine are indispensable to prevent renewed aggression and ensure long-term stability. In this context, transatlantic unity regarding support for Ukraine and Russia and the aggressors and enablers like Cuba remains essential. Strengthening sanctions, increasing political isolations, and closing loopholes that allow Russia to promote the aggression are the instruments that international community has at their disposal to achieve peace. And these instruments must be used in full. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Ambassador, for your presentation. And the next speaker, no one knows the problem of the Cuban mercenaries better than Orlando Gutierrez who works closely with the Ukrainian institution on this issue. Orlando, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I am very thankful to the ECR for organizing this important hearing on a pressing issue, which is the issue of the total support of the Castro regime for the brutal genocidal aggression against the people of Ukraine. And I want to congratulate the Ukrainian ambassador and the members of parliament who have spoken before me for their accurate depiction of what is going on. My very brief remarks I have titled "The Castro Regime, Russian Gendarme, both red and black." It is vital that the European Union see the Castro regime not as an accidental Cuban Russian ally, but as a systematic servant to Russian imperialism. Even before taking power, the Castro regime had begun to establish contacts with Soviet or Russian intelligence. And throughout its history, this regime has acted over and over again, using its military forces at the behest of Soviet and Russian imperial designs in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, and as we're seeing now in Ukraine. We must also, it is appalling to me how a very important fact has been continuously ignored by many European policymakers. And that includes the self-defense, the mutual defense treaty signed between the Cuban dictatorship and the Minsk dictatorship. That treaty calls for the stationing of Cuban troops in Belarus, as Cuban media has proclaimed, Cuban state media, and also Belarus. In other words, a few miles away from NATO member countries such as Poland or Lithuania or Estonia, we have the presence of Cuban troops. The Castro dictatorship's support for the special military operation is diplomatic, political, and also with forces, with armed forces. Diplomatic, over and over again, the Castro regime diplomacy has acted to try and thwart and prevent the actions of Ukrainian diplomacy at several key international meetings, in one of them even helping to prevent President Zelensky from speaking. Politically, the Castro regime has very clearly stated that the Russian invasion of the people of Ukraine from Ukrainian soil is part of a much larger struggle against the United States and Europe. This is not something that I am coming up with. It's something the regime has said over and over again. So Europe should not lie to itself about what this regime is saying and how it shares in the goals of the invasion with the Moscow government. We must also understand that the Cuban regime, the Castro dictatorship, has organically reproduced Russian institutions and military organizations. Cuban intelligence services, the Cuban military, the Cuban special repressive units are modeled on the Soviet system, and now, even to this day, count on extensive GRU support and also support from China. It is for these reasons that the suspension of the political dialogue and cooperation agreement is an urgent need for the European Union. It does not make sense to sanction Putin financially and then to finance the dictatorship in Cuba simultaneously. It is an incoherent policy of trying to sanction Russia for its crimes against humanity while financing one of Russia's main proxies and main allies. And we must also make another important point. The participation of Cuban personnel in the war against Ukraine is not limited to individual soldiers, but also Cuban Special Forces units have participated. The Cuban Special Forces are the core of Communist Party identity, which justifies its existence based on an international agenda or program of destroying U.S. and European hegemony in the world. Cuba is a police state, a totalitarian state. And anyone who believes that a nationwide recruitment of men in Cuba could take place without the active collaboration of the Castro regime does not understand what a totalitarian state is. The same ministry that arms and equips the special Cuban forces which fought in Caracas to protect Maduro and which have gone to Belarus and have gone to Ukraine is the same ministry that gives passports to travel to Russia to thousands of men of diverse age. Ukrainian television has documented the presence not just of Cuban recruits, but of Cuban special forces in key battles of the Russian war against Ukraine in Bakhmut. And Cuban units have fought together with the Russian storm units and with the Wagner Group. In my trips to Ukraine, I have managed to interview most of the Cuban prisoners of war. And through those interviews and our own research, we have full confirmation that an active network of recruitment with the support and the participation of the Castro regime is carrying out a not so covert operation to bring support to the Russian forces from the Cuban side. Lastly, we must ask ourselves what will be the future use of these fighters mobilized by the Castro regime under Russian command in Ukraine. Which dictatorship will they be used to prop up? We had the very real example of Nicaragua in 2018, Venezuela in 2019 and 2020, when these Cuban special forces, the Special National Brigades, also known as the Black Berets, acted to crush popular uprisings against dictatorship. I urge the European Union to end the PDCA and for European governments to actively review, supervise the loans and the financing by the Club of Paris to the Castro dictatorship, because this is money that winds up in the hands of Cuba's repressive apparatus and paying for the regime's mercenary forces in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Orlando. The next speaker is Rosa Maria Paya, the founder of the Cuba Decide and renewed human rights advocate. With no introduction. is the daughter of the late Osvaldo Payar and the fearless campaigner for freedom in Cuba. She has notoriously spoken out against the regime role in Russia war machine, including in international forums, emphasizing that such large-scale treatment cannot fuel without Havana's facilitation, the betrayal of the Cuban people and international norms. So, this we can connect off. Hello,
Hello, Mr. Bularse.
nice to meet you. Nice to
Very, very nice to see you. Thank you so much to all our friends in ECR for this invitation, Dmitry Kaminsky to Fidanza, also Ambassador Diakon, and to Orlando Gutierrez for this initiative and the Asamblea de la Resistencia Cubana. As we have witnessed during this afternoon for you, this morning for us here in the Americas, at the heart of this alliance are the deep-rooted military and political ties between Havana and Moscow, rejuvenated under Vladimir Putin's rule. This partnership has evolved from ideological partnership during the Cold War to a pragmatic union aimed at countering U.S. influence. It is known that Cuba and Russia have signed many cooperation agreements, including the 2009 bilateral accord that established a military and security strategic alliance. As Ambassador Diakon mentioned, the Cuban regime has expressed its unconditional support from the Kremlin since the early days of the invasion in Ukraine, since February 2022. In response, Moscow has made promises of investments, increased cooperation with the island, and the strengthening of the military sphere. The European Union, the Council of Europe, the United Nations Human Rights Council, NATO, and many states at the national level have taken steps to support Ukrainian people and pressure the Russian regime. However, the Cuban regime continues to wage this war of aggression with virtual impunity. And we Cubans, we know very well the cost of impunity. It means state terrorism against Cuban citizens. It means repression. It means torture. It means thousands of Cuban political prisoners in jail today. It means death. And now the world has witnessed how the Cuban regime has taken part in human rights violations not only in Cuba, but also in Venezuela. And through his support to this war of aggression, also human rights violations of the Ukrainian people. The cost, the impact of that the world has suffered for having tolerated the Cuban regime operations with impunity or with inaction has been also gross violations of human rights in the Americas and now in Ukraine. Havana is Putin's closest ally in our hemisphere. As we know, Cuba has allowed the deployment of thousands of nationals to fight in Ukraine, making it one of the largest sources of foreign recruits in Russia's invasion. The Council of Europe declaration of Russia as a terrorist state and its decision to exclude Russia from that body marked a significant diplomatic setback for Russia, but that's not enough. These actions, coupled with the European Parliament resolution recognizing Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. Furthermore, the Resolution 2506 by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe recognized Cuba as an ally of Russia in the aggression against Ukraine. I think it's about time that the European Union go ahead and recognize the obvious. The Cuban regime is sponsoring terrorism. There has been no consequence for the regime so far. And amidst this backdrop, the European Union continues the financial support of the Cuban regime under a political dialogue and cooperation agreement that becomes increasingly unsustainable. The funds ostensibly aimed at fostering cooperation are instead fueling corruption and repression in Cuba, undermining the principles and values that the European Union stands for. The call to action for the European Union is clear. It must cease funding the aggressor's ally regime. It must cease funding the Cuban regime machinery of repression and corruption. And I know that all the friends that are here today agree with that statement, and I believe that the facts that we are witnessing, what the world have seen during the last weeks about the involvement of the Cuban regime should be enough to expedite these actions, to stop the funding of the Cuban regime, and to go ahead and explore avenues to also condemn the criminals that are in power in Cuba for their gross violations of human rights on the island and beyond, and especially in European territory. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Rosa, for your testimony, for your expertise, for your fight for Cuba. And see you soon, I hope. The next speaker is from the US. This conference is being closely following on the other side of the Atlantic. A few weeks ago, a similar briefing took place in the US Congress, hosted by Congressman Mario Díaz-Balart, a leading voice in Congress on an issue related to Cuba. Let us hear the video message from the Mario Díaz-Balart, Congressman from the US Congress. Please.
To my colleagues, greetings from Washington, D.C. We're now in the midst of hopefully finalizing the appropriation bills for fiscal year 2026. It's a privilege and an honor to participate with you, even though it has to be done via video. Particularly, I want to thank my colleagues, Kaminsky, Idanza, Malerzik, for making this possible. It is hugely important. You know, the Western Hemisphere sometimes is something that people kind of take for granted, that things are always going to be fine, but they're not. And we see it time and time again by the influence of these terrorist, narco-terrorist regimes in the Western Hemisphere. Not only do they affect the national security interests of the United States, but they also affect Europe. And we're seeing it very, 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 very directly with the hundreds and hundreds of Cuban mercenaries, military people, who are now in Europe, literally fighting and killing Ukrainians on behalf of Putin. And yet, unfortunately, so many of our European friends and allies continue to treat the communist Castro regime. By the way, it is still Raul Castro, by the way, who's in control in Havana. They treat it as if it was okay. If it was okay, we should continue to give concession after concession and credit and financing and legitimacy. But here's the problem. At the same time that our European allies are asking, and I think with good reason, for help from the United States to help defeat Putin in Europe, a lot of our European friends are helping to solidify, to give credits, to give financing and legitimacy to Putin's strongest ally 90 miles away from the United States. That has to end. We cannot continue to play this game. If we're going to be serious about human rights, we have to confront the Castro dictatorship. If we're going to be serious about labor rights, we have to confront the Castro dictatorship. And if we're going to be serious about the security interests of Europe, the EU, and the United States, we have to stop giving legitimacy, funding, and frankly, credits to the Castro regime. So to all of you, my colleagues in the European Parliament, you have been wonderful in standing up for freedom, for human rights. But I implore you to also make sure that the member states stop helping, stop financing, stop giving legitimacy to an enemy of its own people in the Western Hemisphere, an enemy of the United States, and now that even has troops fighting side by side with Putin's troops in this effort to eliminate and to kill off Ukrainian liberty and sovereignty. Thank you for listening to me. Let's stand together for freedom, and that includes freedom in the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you for this strong message. And the next speaker is the U.S. Senate. Is also very concerned about the situation. We have a special message from Senator Alexis Calatayud. So please.
My name is Alexis Calatayud. I represent Miami in the Florida Senate. The Cuban regime is the most important ally of Russia in the genocidal aggression against Ukrainians in diplomatic, military, and intelligence terms. Mercenary troops of the Cuban regime are in Venezuela, Belarus, and Ukraine, implementing Russia's expansionist foreign policy. How can the European Union finance such a regime that brutalizes its own people and props up dictatorships around the world? The European Union's policy on Cuba is self-defeating. What message is the EU sending to the US with policy support for the Castro dictatorship? European projects in Cuba help finance the Castro regime's security apparatus, not just against Cubans, but against allies and friends of freedom around the world.
Thank you very much. Another important voice in Congress on Cuban affairs is Congressman Carlos Jimenez, who has shared with us his assessment of the decades-long military cooperation between the regime in Havana and Moscow. Congressman Carlos Jimenez, please.
Hi, I'm Congressman Carlos Jimenez, Florida's 28th congressional district. Since the Castro dictatorship seized power in 1959, to this day, it has placed its mercenary troops and terrorist forces at the behest of every foreign military venture, occupation, and invasion that Moscow has ordained. The Castro terrorist dictatorship has not ceased to act as what it is, an illegitimate regime and gendarme of Russian imperialism. From Algeria to Syria, from Ethiopia to Angola, and now from Venezuela to Ukraine, the Castro dictatorship's military has never wavered from its service to Moscow. The key question then, at this crucial time is, why is the European Union financing the interventionist Cuban dictatorship? What are the links between the Cuban regime and the executive politicians of the European Union? What is the interest of the European Union in subsidizing the brutal dictatorship of Cuba? It's very difficult to understand why the European Union is giving millions of euros to Cuba, a puppet and collaborator of Russia, who is sending troops to kill Ukrainians. The hundreds of millions of euros the European Union is sending to the Cuban regime, an enemy of Europe, should be given instead to Ukraine for its defense, or put away for its reconstruction. It does not make sense that the European Union, through the political dialogue and cooperation agreement and the Club of Paris, continues to finance the anti-American, anti-European policies and actions of the Castro dictatorship. Hi.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear friends, we have heard the position of the leading American politician. However, the issue of Havana's cooperation with Russia, as well as the harmful Russian and Cuban influence, is of concern to almost the entire Western Hemisphere. From Buenos Aires, Giuliano Viglio has joined us. He addressed this issue within the framework of the Union of Latin American Parties. Giuliano Viglio, Honorary Chairman of the Union of Latin American Parties. Please, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, presidente. Muchísimas gracias a los anfitriones y al PCR Group por armar esta importantísima reunión donde estamos todos aquellos que defendemos los valores de Occidente. Yo hace 8 años ya que tengo la responsabilidad de ser vicepresidente primero y luego presidente de la Organización de Partidos Políticos de toda América Latina. que reúne a todos los partidos políticos de centro derecha o de derecha del continente de América Latina, algunos más liberales, otros más conservadores, pero todos los partidos políticos importantes con posibilidad de gobernar en la región latinoamericana están en esta organización. Y nuestra responsabilidad es trabajar por defender nuestros valores, los valores que defendemos en el triángulo atlántico, que hoy están representados en esta reunión, que creo que es lo más importante. Hemos escuchado posiciones bien claras de los representantes de los Estados Unidos, bien claras de los representantes de Europa y definitivamente los latinoamericanos que defendemos estos valores, creemos en las mismas ideas, defendemos los mismos principios y creo que tenemos que estar más juntos que nunca. Y la batalla que se está dando aquí en Europa es la misma que se está dando en América Latina. La agresión que sufre Ucrania desde Rusia con apoyo de Cuba es lo mismo que nosotros tenemos que combatir en nuestro continente. Por eso la causa cubana y la causa venezolana y la causa de Nicaragua están en el tope de nuestras prioridades. Porque nosotros sabemos perfectamente que si logramos derrotar esos regímenes, estamos dando más libertad y más democracia a todo el triángulo de valores atlántico. Y esto es absolutamente central, con lo cual yo celebro muchísimo esta reunión. Creo que es importantísimo fortalecer estos mecanismos de trabajo conjunto y hasta me atrevo a decir, sin importar tanto las familias políticas, porque hay causas como la cubana, o la venezolana, o la nicaragüense, que atraviesan por completo todas las familias políticas. O sea, la mayoría de las familias políticas coincidimos en que hay que respetar la libertad y la democracia como principios esenciales para el desarrollo, para la igualdad de oportunidades, para el crecimiento personal y en sociedad. Entonces, me parece que tenemos que fortalecer este trabajo conjunto y lograr estos pequeños éxitos que nos van permitiendo avanzar en esta batalla de ideas en la que todos estamos metidos, ¿no? Porque fíjense si sale bien la operación que ha iniciado los Estados Unidos, que es importantísima, y quiero destacar acá la valentía que ha tenido la administración del presidente Trump de intervenir directamente en Venezuela para poder iniciar allí un proceso de transición que sin dudas va a tener efectos no solamente en Venezuela, sino que también en el régimen cubano y posiblemente también en el régimen de Nicaragua. Haber iniciado eso es una valentía enorme. Y me parece que no tenemos que preguntarnos tanto si se cumplieron determinadas formas o no, sino lo que tenemos que decir es cómo hacemos para apoyar a la administración americana. Y tal vez no hay que esperar tanto que la administración americana venga a explicarnos a los latinoamericanos o a los europeos por qué lo hizo, cómo tomó la decisión, o un montón de cuestiones que a veces estamos esperando que nos expliquen, sino a veces hay que ir a preguntar cómo podemos ayudar, cómo podemos hacer que esto sea exitoso. Y en ese sentido, nosotros hemos puesto todos nuestros esfuerzos en la causa cubana, en recibir todas las denuncias de la participación de mercenarios cubanos junto a las tropas rusas para dividir Ucrania. Le hemos dado muchísima difusión a esto, le hemos dado muchísima difusión a toda la resistencia democrática venezolana y estamos seguros que estamos en un proceso que va a ser extremadamente exitoso. Y fíjense la importancia que tiene que sea exitosa la intervención en Venezuela y sin duda posteriormente la caída del régimen totalitario cubano. Vamos a estar dando un golpe directo al narcotráfico global. Esto no es un tema de América Latina, es un golpe al narcotráfico global. Vamos a estar atacando al crimen organizado a nivel global. Vamos a estar debilitando toda la izquierda antidemocrática que se nutre de las ideas de estos regímenes totalitarios y de los fondos de estos regímenes totalitarios. Y sin duda vamos a estar fortaleciendo los incentivos para respetar la democracia y promover la libertad. Entonces, como conclusión, yo propongo fortalecer estos vínculos de trabajo, propongo darle mucha visibilidad a estas cuestiones y sin duda para mí es absolutamente inexplicable cómo puede ser que Europa siga financiando un régimen como el cubano para que ese régimen luego envíe tropas con esos recursos para atacar a Europa. ¿Alguien puede responder esta pregunta? Entonces me parece que este Parlamento ya ha generado una cantidad de iniciativas en el sentido de terminar con la cooperación europea con Cuba Y me parece que es el momento de pedirle a la comisaria Calas que firme una vez por todas la resolución que termina la cooperación europea con el régimen totalitario y destructivo de Cuba. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Julian. Now we have the guest speakers from Verkhovna Rada. Verkhovna Rada is currently in session, therefore joining us online rather than in person is MPs Marian Zagorski, who in the Ukrainian parliament is responsible for the contact with the Cuban opposition. Marian Zagorski, member of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine online. Please.
Thank you very much for this event. But if you don't mind, I have a speaker here from our main military intelligence who has to leave soon, as the meeting is going rather long. So he'll present you the official data. He's actually the authority, and I will translate for him, and afterwards I will speak.
Yes.
So Andrei Yusov, the spokesperson for the Chief Military Intelligence Agency of Ukraine.
Thank you very much.
Доброго дня, шановні присутні. Дякуємо за обговорення цієї важливої теми в такому високому товаристві.
Thank you very much, dear guests, for the ability to talk about such important problem at such a high level.
Проблема залучення іноземних найманців та іноземних громадян до російської агресії проти України є справді масштабною, лише набирає обертів.
The problem of foreign mercenaries in Russian army is truly large scale, and currently it's only increasing in perpetuity.
З початку повномасштабного вторгнення з 22-го року кількість іноземних громадян в лавах окупаційної російської армії лише зростає.
Since the beginning of the invasion, the percentage of foreigners in the Russian army is only increasing.
Зараз відомі точні особисті дані понад 24 тисяч найманців та іноземних громадян, які воюють за Путіна.
We know the exact personal names and details of over 24,000 foreigners that are currently fighting for Putin.
Насправді ця цифра є більшою.
Of course, this number is bigger since these are only identified individuals.
Якщо говорити окремо про Кубу, то громадяни Куби входять в п'ятірку країн, громадяни яких найчастіше залучаються російським агресором.
As we talk about Cuba, Cuba is at the top of the list of foreigners that are being attracted by Russia.
На кінець 25-го року відомі особисті дані понад 1000 громадян Куби, яких путінський режим завербував для війни проти України.
As of the end of 2025, we know the personal data for over 1,000 Cuban mercenaries, but again, these are only the names, those that have been positively identified with names.
І ця цифра також може бути більшою.
And of course, the actual number of people of Cubans in the Russian army is high.
Відомі особисті дані понад 40 громадян Куби, які загинули, виконуючи накази Путіна.
We know the personal data of over 40 Cubans that were killed in the Russian army.
Понад 250 громадян Куби, у яких завершився так званий контракт з російською армією, не змогли повернутися додому і силою були залишені в російській армії для продовження війни.
Also, we positively identified 250 individuals whose contracts from Cuba were ended within the Russian army, but of course, not a single person was allowed to go back. But again, I emphasize these are only known personal data.
Для режиму Путіна залучення іноземних громадян, іноземних найманців є дуже вагомим інструментом зменшення соціальної напруги всередині самої Росії.
For Putin, the recruitment of foreign citizens is an extremely important tool to lower the internal tensions of recruitment of the Russian soldiers.
Приховування реальних втрат.
It allows him to hide the actual losses.
А також економії коштів, тому що іноземний громадянин і найманець обходиться путінському бюджету менше, ніж виплати на громадянина Російської Федерації.
And of course, saving the funds, because it is much cheaper to hire foreigners, for example, from Cuba, than to actually give bonuses and salaries to Russians.
Серед іноземних громадян, і це стосується також і громадян Куби, велика кількість людей, яких обманом залучили до служби в путінській армії.
Among foreigners, and specifically among Cubans, there are lots of people who sign contracts under cons, so they being cheated into signing them.
Їм обіцяли швидке отримання російського громадянства, не участь в бойових діях і що вони будуть перебувати далеко від фронту.
They were promised a quick Russian citizenship, participating in non-combat operations outside of the battlefield.
Але правда є такою, що іноземні громадяни в армії Путіна використовуються переважно для участі в найскладніших штурмових діях путінської армії проти України.
But the truth is that all the foreigners are being used exactly at the most dangerous and the most deadly assaults on Ukrainian army.
І відповідно втрати там також дуже високі.
And of course the losses among any foreigners are extremely high.
А отриманих обіцяних винагород і виплат часто не отримують.
It's very often that the mercenaries do not get the promised payouts and even salaries.
Зокрема, це стало причиною зростання кількості іноземних громадян в армії РФ, які добровільно здаються в полон до сил безпеки і оборони України.
Because of this, we are fixing and seeing an increased number of foreigners that are willingly go to Ukrainian army as prisoners so forth.
У 2005 році таких було вдвічі більше, ніж у 2004.
In 2025, there was double the number of foreigners that gave themselves up to Ukrainian army compared to the year before.
Зараз в Україні в спеціальних місцях утримання полонених ворогів перебуває 166 іноземців з 40 країн світу.
So far, we have 166 different prisoners from 40 different countries.
Вони всі перебувають в спеціальних місцях утримання військовополонених, їхні права захищені згідно міжнародного права і Женевської конвенції.
They are being held properly in detention centers, and of course their human rights are, according to international conventions, are protected.
Багато з них дають згоду на спілкування із медіа і представниками міжнародних організацій.
Majority of them give consent to talk to foreign media and human rights groups.
Також багато з них не хочуть повертатись до Росії і виступають проти обміну в тому числі, оскільки знають, що російська армія відправить їх назад на війну в участь в штурмових діях.
Vast majority of them do not want to go back to Russia and actually against them being exchanged for Ukrainian prisoners.
Міжнародна єдність і тиск на агресора діє і в контексті залучення найманців іноземних громадян.
So the international pressure is vital in terms of how Russia is able to recruit foreigners.
Завдяки спільній жорсткій позиції Європейського Союзу, Сполучених Штатів, у 25-му році в цілій низці країн найманців Путіну стало залучати важче, і їх стало менше, ніж було попередньо.
Is that thanks to joint pressure from the United States and from the European Union, there are a number made it much harder to attract foreigners to the Russian army.
Це означає, що цей тиск працює і його варто посилювати.
So this means that this pressure works and it should be strengthened.
Дякуємо за стійку підтримку України і міжнародної архітектури безпеки і міжнародного права.
We are, on behalf of Chief Military Intelligence, we are extremely grateful for the support of international order of security, and thank you for your support for Ukraine. If you have any questions towards military channel, you can ask for, and I also, or I can process to my speech.
Yes, please. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to ECR for having this meeting. I actually also am the chairman of Caucus of Ukrainian Conservatives, and now one of our stated goals is to cooperate with ECR. I've been on most of ECR events, and it's a privilege to have you invited me again. With regards to Cuban mercenaries, my colleague was referring to the basically hacked data that was of Cuban mercenaries that were recruited just within one unit over 8 months period. The assessment that our Ministry of Foreign Affairs presented at the United Nations is that at least 5,000 are deployed already. Of course, many of them are killed on the Russian side from Cuba. And the official position of Ukraine is that Cuba is the largest source of foreigners to fight on Russian side. Of course, there are North Koreans, but these are not mercenaries. They do not have free will to join. But with the Cuban dictatorship, Russians operate freely in Cuba, and of course, our assessment is that, of course, among those recruited, there are some representatives of the Kingdom Armed Forces or security agencies. We have currently at least 4 Cuban prisoners captured. I was able to interview 3 of them. It's a horrifying situation. Basically, one of the prisoners told us that he is much happier in prison than in Cuba because for the first time in his life he eats 3 times a day. He was really praising even the prison foods inside Ukrainian prisons. And this just tells you the desperation that Cuban people have back at home. And in general, I completely agree with the assessment at the beginning of the speeches from my Polish colleagues that look, the largest supporters of Russia are all designated by the United States as sponsors of terror. North Korea has sent more than 3 million artillery shells. You know that the biggest threat to our infrastructure are Iranian drones. The biggest supplier of foreign mercenaries is the Cuban regime. And by the way, the Venezuelan so-called government was one of the key sources of manufacturing of those Iranian drones. We are quite happy that this operation went through, and as far as you know, some of those facilities were damaged. By the way, the production facilities for Iranian drones were positioned in the same city outside Caracas. That's just last year, Russia has officially opened their military factory of producing Kalashnikovs and ammunition. Also, what is the threat of specifically the Cuban mercenaries? First of all, they will be used for some crappy so-called revolutionary Che Guevara battalions or whatever they plan to call them in order to prop up dictatorship and create hell. Secondly, they will be the best people to be recruited by cartels, increasing the threat of the other world. And this week I'll be also talking to the Guyanese government because, you know, Venezuela, at the request of Russia, has a territorial claim on them, and we expect further destabilization in North-South America. And just a small reminder, one of my favorite questions from geography is which border is the longest together with France. Is actually French Guiana. It's not so far away, and they, by our assessment, are planning some operations there. So we need a very strong joint action against all of that, and to that, on behalf of Ukrainian Parliament, we ask so that EU stops funding the Cuban regime because they are evil and they cause a lot of the deaths of Ukrainians, not mentioning the treatment of their own citizens. And second, but please look very closely, and maybe the members of ECR can ask their own Ministry of Foreign Affairs how the Cuban regime treats the funding of the embassies inside Cuba. Because I can tell you that the Cuban regime has stolen $300,000 from Ukrainian embassy. We closed the embassy in Cuba, we announced the severing of ties and everything. But I know from our former representatives in Cuba that the same situation was with all the embassies inside Cuba. So please take a look at that. So they do not have normal diplomacy. They basically, most likely they are stealing the funds from your diplomatic representatives. That's it from my side, and thank you for this event and for your continued support for Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear friends. And I know I get the information that Alexander Mershko is not present because he has the committee foreign affairs and he chairing this committee. So, dear colleagues, we finished our speakers. So I would like to thank you, all of you. And I would like to once again thank today's all speakers for the insights and all the participants for being here today. I'm sure you will all agree it has been a fruitful discussion. Following today's exchange, we intend to send a joint letter to the European Commission President von der Leyen and the EU High Representative Kaja Kallas the letter we urge the European Commission to reconsider and ultimately cut economic ties with Cuba, as the funds flowing from the EU to Havana only serve to reinforce the Cuban regime. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. The meeting is closed. Thank you.